Hi guys, so my name's Nate and I'm with the Amsterdam Free Library, and today I'd like to talk to you guys a little bit about 3D printing. Now, why are we talking about 3D printing? Well, the library has had a 3D printer for some time, and right now we're actually working on a better way that we could roll that out to the public for public use. And in order for us to really do that, we'd like to make you guys aware of what 3D printers are, what they have to offer, and yeah, just about how easy they are to use. So a 3D printer actually works by melting a very thin plastic, and it actually will creates plastics a layer at a time. So basically what they'll do is they'll take a little wired piece of plastic called filament. I've got a little piece right here. It's really thin. And it passes it through, for lack of a better word, a heat gun, which we call an extruder. That'll actually heat it up to about 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and it'll melt it. And that extruder is actually shaped a lot like a pen, and what this will do is it'll actually draw on a surface called a build plate. And so as this printer draws, it's going to create an actual object very slowly, mind you, over the course of a number of hours. And it'll just create these solid objects by going one layer at a time until eventually, you'll start with something flat, and that's going to build and build and build, and then suddenly the object you had on the computer screen is now on your build plate, and you can use it for, well, whatever. And so 3D models are basically that bit of information that you actually need to plug into a printer for it to spit it out. And now 3D models come in a number of formats. So the 3D models, these are the same things that people use to make objects in video games. And so in order to print those things, they actually have to be in a very specific file format, either .stl or .obj, so object file. And basically what we do is we put them in a computer program, and the one I'm about to show you guys is actually called Cura, and we're going to take a 3D model and basically prepare it for printing. And so let's get started, and I'll show you guys what's what. Alright, so now that we've got my computer screen in front of us, what I'll do is I'll go in and I'll search for this program I mentioned, Ultimaker Cura. Now the great thing about Cura is that it's open source, meaning that it's free to use. And so you can take your 3D printer, whatever model it is, search for it in there, and then it'll make things. It'll basically make things specific to your printer. It'll tell your printer how to make a certain file. So now we've got the main screen here. I mentioned a build plate earlier, and right here is actually a digital representation of the build plate. I'm using a Creality's Ender 3 3D printer, which has a build plate of about 7.9, almost 8 inches, 8 by 8 inches, roughly. And so in order for us to get started, you can see here all these different things about the Ender 3. I'm using a 0.4 millimeter nozzle to squeeze all that plastic out onto this plate. And I keep it at about 0.16 millimeters. So that's the filament as it gets spit out. Now to put something on this plate and for us to print it, we go up here to the open button. And we have a number of things to pick out. Now, before that, I guess the other thing we should be dealing with first is where we get our 3D models. Now, the cool thing about that is that if we go on the internet nowadays, there's this really neat website called Thingiverse. So let me type that in, thingiverse.com. And Thingiverse is to 3D models what YouTube is to videos. And so you can come in here and you can find just about anything you want. So there's a search bar up here, and let's think of something random. Let's go with squirrels. So we'll type in squirrels, We'll hit enter. Yeah, and there's a bunch of stuff here about squirrels. So these are all 3D models of squirrels. And I like this little blue one over here in the corner. Now, that's the other important thing I'll mention, is that when we go to print something, it's not going to come out the color that you see here in the picture. It's going to come out in whatever color you chose for your filament. And now 3D printer filament comes in a number of colors. You can get it in red, blue, green, black, white, gold, silver. I'm even told they make glow in the dark now. So just about any color you could think of, you can get in the filament, get in your filament, and yeah, you can print things out in any color you want. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit download all files. And okay, of course we're going to get some form of pop-up ad there, but it says downloading files. And down here it's going to say, what do you want to do with squirrel.zip? And basically a .zip file, it's kind of like, it's almost like a suitcase for your files. It takes a file and it actually compresses it, making it smaller than it really is, just to move it around, get it across the internet. And of course, when we get a .zip file, we have to unzip it. We have to take it out of that suitcase. And Windows lets you do that. So it'll show us what's in the suitcase before we can use it. And we'll say extract all. And we'll choose where we want to put it. And so it'll show us all the files on our computer. There's this PC. I'm going to put it down here in data D under 3D printing. And then I'll hit select folder and then extract. And since I already did it once today, I'll replace it with the one in the destination just so you guys can see. And now we have our squirrel file down here. And so what we'll do from there is we'll open Ultimaker Cura back up. And we have to take that file, that .stl file, and I'll even prove it to you here. We'll take a step back. And we'll go back to 3D printing and we'll check on Mr. Squirrel. See, it's over here it only says he's a 3D object, but if we right click and hit properties, well, maybe not for the whole folder, but make sure we click on the squirrel first. And it'll show us here that he is a .stl. So it says your type of file, 3D object, but then if we highlight there, we could see it's .stl. And that's one of the two major formats used in 3D printing. So now we're going to go over here into Cura. We're going to hit up here in the upper left this little box that looks like a folder. And what that's telling us to do is that's to open a file. So I already have it set to open here in the 3D printing folder that I made. And we've got Mr. Squirrel that we just put here. So we'll hit open. And now what Cura does is it takes your 3D model file and it turns it into something called G-code. Now G-code sounds really techy and really complicated, but what G-code is it's the model you're printing, but it's also the set of commands that are going to go into your printer. It's what we're printing and how we want it made. That's what we're telling the printer when we make G-code like this. And so you go over here into print settings for Cura, and there are a number of settings. Quality, so that's the size, the radius of the plastic as it's being squeezed out of the extruder. That heat gun I talked about earlier. Down here we have infill. Now infill is basically how much plastic we actually want the object to use. So usually out of the box, infill is set to 20, and it'll come up with a pattern, this series of structures inside your model to keep it upright and supported and put together nicely, but also so that it doesn't take up the entire, well, squirrel for the lack of a better word. So if we leave this at 20% infill, most of the inside of this model is going to be made with air. So let's say we want to make him very, very dense. What we would do is we would leave that at 100% infill, and then it would fill the entire squirrel in, every inch of the squirrel, with plastic. So then he would be a very dense, very solid object and not very light. So I'm going to leave that at 20%, and then it's going to go into materials. And what this does is this tells your printer how to handle the material it's using to make the squirrel. Now some 3D printers, like the one I'm using, the Creality Ender 3, have both a heated nozzle, which I mean every 3D printer needs, but also a heated bed. And what a heated bed offers is it keeps the plastic at the very base of the model very malleable, very sticky with all of that excess heat. And what that does is that keeps the model in place. It keeps our squirrel and its components from moving around on the build plate and turning into a really nasty mess. So if we go down underneath here, we've got speed. We can even change how fast our model's being made. I would advise not to go too crazy with this though, because the higher the number here, millimeters per second, the faster the speed at which you attempt to make something, more often than not, the worse it's going to look when it comes out. That age-old saying really shines true here. Slow and steady wins the race. So I always leave that at about 50. If I really need to save time, I'll only ever go up to 60. Because you'll still basically get the same quality, but you'll shave about an hour off of your print time. Travel, this is basically just how the nozzle behaves as it's moving across the object to print it. The next most important piece of this is supports. So as I said before, 3D printers work a layer at a time. And so to make really intricate structures, really complicated things, sometimes putting things out in a layer just isn't going to work. So what the printer will do is it'll actually make a series of supports. And you can actually see in the model where they're going to go if we just look underneath the squirrel here for a minute. You can see all these little red and pink areas. These are all the places where the computer's thinking about putting supports to keep the squirrel together, upright, and well supported while it's being made. And so your computer's going to put supports there, and then your printer's going to print out these structures that are just going to keep everything in place as it prints. Now the cool thing about supports is they look very permanent once your print is done, but usually what you can do is you can pop your print off, or you can pop the supports off of your print, and most of the time it'll look like they're never even there. You know, sometimes you might get a bad apple that's on too tight, but it's nothing hot water and some tweezers doesn't fix. And so now that we have Mr. Squirrel and we left our infill at 20, we'll sit here and say, we'll hit slice. And this is where that conversion actually happens. We're moving from an STL file to that G code that your printer can actually understand and use. Now slicing does take a second, I'll say. But once that's done, we'll get an idea of how much filament we're going to use, how much plastic we're going to use, and how long it's going to take to make this guy. Okay, so as I said, 3D printing can sometimes take hours. And in this case, a squirrel at this size, well, this squirrel at this size, is going to take us 12 hours and 48 minutes, and we're going to be using 25 meters worth of filament, roughly. So that's a long time, and that's a lot of material. So let's just say for a second that we don't need Mr. Squirrel this big, and we don't need him to take up that much room. What we'll do is we'll click on him, and we'll go over to the left here, and there's a scale option. So we'll click scale. and we have all these axes that we can control. So we'll go to the blue one up here, and we'll click and drag it down. And as we do that, Mr. Squirrel gets just a little bit smaller. And so now that he's a little bit smaller, he's going to use a lot less material. Let's see how long he takes to print out. Hit slice. Okay, so he's now only going to take 2 hours and 16 minutes. And I'm just going to use this time, now that you've seen how long some of these prints can take, to say that when 3D printing, especially if you're at home, it's always important to supervise your prints, check on them periodically. Definitely don't leave them unattended for extended periods, because again, these are materials, you've got equipment here that gets very hot, and you just want to be safe and smart about that. The printer that we use at the library, we actually have thermal runaway protection that actually protects us from that sort of thing. But not every printer does, so it's just important to keep that in mind. So different 3D printers deliver their G-code differently. In the case of the Ender 3 that I'm using, I have to pop it onto an SD card. The MakerBot that the library uses, we would need a USB thumb drive. These are both things that you can go up and get at the nearest Walmart, you know, and they're usually only a couple of dollars. And then from there you can just put your G-code on there, open them up using your 3D printer, and find Mr. Squirrel, or whatever object you hope to use. But to get it from Cura into that thumb drive, I'm just going to hit Save to File to show you folks here. We'll hit this PC, and your thumb drive would appear in this option here, your thumb drive or your SD card. So I'll just pretend that our SD card is data drive D here, and we'll hit Open. And we've got CE3 Squirrel. Save as file type down here, G-code, so .G-code. And we'll just hit Save. Already exists, are you sure? We want to overwrite it? Sure. I'm only doing that because I already did it once today. And now we have usable G-code that our printer is going to churn out. And then hopefully by the end of that, we'd be the proud owner of a tiny plastic squirrel. So yeah, that's just a little primer on 3D printers. And I'm hoping that down the road we can do another video on how to cut 3D prints, 3D models, how we can take large objects and basically print them using small build plates. Maybe even if we get the opportunity, we'll go into Tinkercad, which is a free CAD software where you can make your own objects for 3D printing. But on that note, I just want to thank you all for joining us tonight. And yeah.